The catastrophic Tenerife airport disaster rocked the aviation industry to its foundations. On March 27, 1977, the deadly runway crash occurred in the Canary Islands between two Boeing 747 passenger airplanes. This devastating disaster resulted in the loss of more than 580 lives. What contributed more to the most terrifying airplane catastrophe at Los Rodeos Airport, the first officer's unfamiliarity with the airport or the unusual volume of traffic. Stay with us as we take a look back at the deadliest aviation accident ever. Tenerife is an island in Spain's Canary Islands, located in the Atlantic Ocean close to Africa's northwest coast. Out of all the Canary Islands, it is the biggest. The incident involved the clash of two highly loaded 747 passenger aircraft on the runway. Pan American World Airways and KLM piloted the jumbo jets in question. That day, both planes had diverted to the airport and were getting ready to take off again, this time towards Gran Canaria. Both planes burst into flames as the impact's energy tore through the Pan Am plane's fuselage. On board the KLM aircraft, every passenger and member of the crew died. More than 60 people, including the pilot, survived the crash and fire on the Pan Am aircraft, but at least 330 people died. A hole close to the left wing of the aircraft allowed many people to flee. A number of factors played a role in the disaster, including unclear weather and unusual airport traffic. But wait, did the KLM airliner start its takeoff with proper approval? Some experts believed they didn't. What additional factors, aside from the pilot mistake and departure without clearance, contributed to the accident? The KLM aircraft involved was Rhine, a 747-200 registered as PH Buff. Since October 1971, KLM has been using it. It was operating as KLM Flight 4805 from Amsterdam Schiphol to Gran Canaria on that fateful day. Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten oversaw the flight, and the other crew members included First Officer Klaas Muurs and Flight Engineer Willem Schreider. When it left Tenerife, there were 234 passengers and 14 crew members on board. Clipper Victor, a 747-100 registered N736PA, was the Pan Am aircraft. January 1970 marked the start of its operation. Pan Am Flight 1736 was in operation that day, traveling from Los Angeles to New York JFK, and then on to Gran Canaria. First Officer Robert Bragg and Captain Victor Grubbs flew it, with Flight Engineer George Warnes accompanying them in the cockpit. It carried 380 passengers and 16 crew members. In aviation, fatal accidents usually occur as the result of a series of mistakes rather than a single blunder or poor decision. Sadly, on that fatal day, an uncontrollable chain of events resulted in the two aircraft using the same runway and being unable to see each other. First of all, neither aircraft was meant to be at that airport. So, why were the flights diverted to Tenerife? A terrorist alert caused them and numerous other aircraft to divert from the neighboring Gran Canaria, Las Palmas airport. There were 8 injuries after a bomb exploded at the terminal. Amid the chaos, a second bomb threat was raised at the scene. The Canary Islands independence movement claimed responsibility for the incident. All arriving aircraft were rerouted to Los Rodeos Airport, which is much smaller. There was just one runway, one parallel taxiway, and not much space for plane parking at the airport. Departing aircraft had to use the runway to taxi into position since the diverted aircraft had to park on the main taxiway. That day, the airport saw significantly more traffic than it had ever seen before, and the 2 air traffic controllers who were on duty had to deal with a lot more traffic. Because of the congestion on the taxiways, departing planes are being directed along the airport's single runway in order to get ready for takeoff. What was the weather situation on that tragic day in the airport area? Was it the weather that caused the detours? Even though weather is an important factor in the disaster, it was not the weather but the bombing that triggered the detours. However, with all the increased plane traffic, the weather in Tenerife wasn't ideal. At 610 meters, Los Rodeos Airport experiences hazy and foggy conditions on a regular basis. The airport's visibility was rapidly reduced due to drifting clouds. This was the situation on the day of the incident. Less than 100 meters was the estimated visibility that the Pan Am aircraft had on the runway, according to the crash report. When the KLM plane took off, it could see clearly at the opposite end of the runway, but clouds were moving down the runway in its direction. The terrible circumstances didn't just block the crew's sight, but also hindered the tower's view. The crash happened when both 747s were trying to depart the airport. The airport in Gran Canaria had reopened, and both flights were on their way. The Pan Am flight was scheduled to depart first because the passengers on the Pan Am flight were still on board, while the passengers on the KLM flight were disembarked. However, Pan Am had to wait for the KLM 747 to clear the runway, preventing it from entering. The first officer and flight engineer got off the plane to check the clearance. When they realized they couldn't pass, they had no other option but to wait. The KLM flight decided to fully refuel before takeoff, which ultimately proved to be fatal and caused further delay. The first officer and flight engineer recommended refueling in Las Palmas, but the captain decided otherwise. At 16:56, the tower cleared the KLM aircraft to taxi the whole length of the runway for departure. By 17:02, the Pan Am aircraft was instructed to start its taxi and exit at the third point. The first officer, Bragg, unfamiliar with the airport, consults a runway diagram to find their way. This required two 148-degree turns to reach the main taxiway. Then, why the third exit, and why did the flight proceed to the fourth exit? The Pan Am continued to taxi along the runway towards the fourth exit because of reduced visibility and unclear instructions. The Pan Am crew carefully listens to the tower controller's instructions given to the KLM crew ahead of them as they make their way along the runway. Something goes wrong out of the blue, just as they are about to have to turn off the runway. First Officer Bragg notices another plane approaching through the dense fog. Confused conversations worsened the situation. The tower gave KLM the go-ahead at 17:06, but they weren't cleared to take off. Radio interference may have prevented the KLM crew from noticing it. Meanwhile, Pan Am reported that they were still taxiing. The two planes were unable to see each other due to fog. The tower asked Pan Am to report when it was clear off the runway. After hearing this in the KLM cockpit, the flight engineer asked the pilots twice if they could see the other aircraft, but there was no follow-up conversation. As the Pan Am plane approached the fourth taxiway, the KLM plane flew down the runway towards it. The Pan Am pilot was the one who initially noticed the aircraft approaching, according to the records from the cockpit. The captain's lightning-fast responses allowed him to engage the accelerator to its maximum and try to steer the plane left, towards the grass. When the KLM crew spotted the other aircraft, they attempted to lift off quickly, but it was too late to stop the aircraft. It lifted off at an acute angle, resulting in a 22-meter tail strike within 100 meters of the Pan Am 747 and traveling at about 260 km/h. The lower fuselage and the main landing gear of the Pan Am plane collided with the upper fuselage. However, the aircraft was able to clear the ground, thanks to its nose and landing gear. The right engine broke free and hit the upper deck. The fuel leak resulted in a fire, which killed most people. The KLM plane stopped and hit the runway around 150 meters past the Pan Am plane due to its low speed and possible engine failure. The KLM flight's full fuel load ended in absolute disaster. What are your thoughts on how this Tenerife airport disaster could have been prevented? Comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video with others if you found it informative. Your support helps us continue to create content like this.